Sober, your cat's in my bag collection again. What the hell are you doing? Oh, nothing much, just improving my experience with the game a bit. I guess the cat's out of the bag now. One of my favorite things about video games is the story. Not necessarily the story in the game, but the story of the game. The development history, the designer's vision, the struggles and trials the game went through as it worked its way into a release. A lot of the times the story is lost or it was simply never told. This is especially common in games that were made before the internet was widespread. Old magazines, newsletters, and interviews are about your only resource, and even then it's buried under PR hype, speculation, or outright fabrications. But occasionally, you come across a game that not only has these details, but also an interesting story to tell. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is definitely one of these games. It's a story you might have already heard. Mystic Quest was meant to introduce a Western audience to the text, number, and story-heavy role-playing games that were thriving in the Japanese market. In Japan, you couldn't keep them on the shelves, but in America they squandered in bargain bins. This left publishers scratching their heads and shrugging their shoulders. One option was to release the games in Japan and be done with it, and in many instances they did. Square and Enix, before they had merged and formed Square Enix, were the two biggest RPG producers. Whichever company would break into the North American market first would have a major advantage. From a business standpoint, it was worth the effort to figure out this mystery of why Americans weren't buying. After all, this was the country that made RPGs from games such as Dungeons & Dragons and Ultima. There had to be an audience somewhere, right? There was no easy way to find out why there was this cultural divide. The most feedback a publisher had from its consumers was boardroom conjecture and those cards that ask you about what games you plan to buy in the future. And let's face it, no one filled out those. It wasn't because their games weren't getting enough exposure. It often took extreme amounts of promotion to gain Western interest. Nintendo Power had given copies of Dragon Warrior away to new subscribers just to get rid of the backstock. It again stacked its chips in order to push Final Fantasy. Even Earthbound saw the most bizarre ad campaign featuring scratch and sniff ads to promote its release. Yet every attempt was met with lukewarm sales. And it wasn't that RPGs were too difficult either. Games like Ultima and Wizardry were known for their steep learning curve and had a fairly niche but growing market. In an effort to possibly introduce newcomers, Final Fantasy IV released in America in 1991, with some features removed and the difficulty reduced. Yet despite selling millions in Japan, in America only sold about 250,000 copies. If it wasn't the promotion or genre's difficulty, it had to be something that they were missing. A lot of critics claim that Mystic Quest was born from the idea that Japanese developers thought Americans were too stupid, I guess, to handle a standard role-playing game. And though this theory has evidence, it's a misconstrued statement. It's not a matter of intellect, it's a matter of familiarity. Role-playing games from a design standpoint are far different than any other genre. Platformers, action games, shooters, even sports games have similarities. You can always tell when you are making progress, either by advancing to the next level or just moving to where the enemies came from. The game immediately grabs your attention and holds on to it from 30 minutes to an hour, and the story often took a backseat if there was one at all. Role-playing games, however, are almost the antithesis. You were often given a goal but made to figure out what you needed to do to achieve that goal. This sense of freedom can make players feel lost, and very rarely did the player's skill matter, but rather the ability to think strategically about your actions as well as build up avatar strength. Each game was more of a slow boil, taking anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour just to get you interested, the experience lasting anywhere from days to weeks. Most importantly, the story wasn't just a background motivation, but rather the selling point for most of these games. The idea was that maybe Western audiences didn't understand what an RPG was or how you would play it. Up until now, game companies were just throwing us into the deep end of the pool and expecting us to learn how to swim. Maybe by building us a kiddie pool, one where it combines familiar elements of other games, could be beaten in about a day, and made use of simplified mechanics, we could see that RPGs weren't the big scary genre and that we could enjoy them. They would make an entry-level RPG. The idea of an entry level to a genre is admittedly a fascinating premise, and as far as I know, the first and only of its kind. We've never had a version of Doom trying to ease us into first-person shooters, and I'm still waiting on Nintendo to make a copy of Nobunaga's I Sorta Wanna Do a Thing that combines strategy with monster capturing elements that... They've done that already. What? Yeah, it was called Pokemon Conquest. Wait, they made that? Square had put the same team that had made Final Fantasy Legend 3 for the Game Boy, led by Chihiro Fujioka, together with Ted Woolsey, who had localized Final Fantasy IV for the English release. They would design a game that would be more approachable to American audiences. Released in America on October 5th, 1992, a year before its Japanese release on September 10th, 1993, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest came into lukewarm reception that over the years boiled into it being labeled the worst Final Fantasy. Its lack of plot, character development, and its almost insultingly easy gameplay was panned by critics. Many gamers view it as a blight on the otherwise flawless history of Square RPGs. At first glance, there is little value to be found in Mystic Quest. Its simplistic gameplay and elementary plot offer nothing to gamers who have already experienced Cecil's redemption, those who have braved the dungeons of wizardry, or became the Avatar in Ultima. Meanwhile, this game offered very little to those who didn't care for the genre to begin with. And newcomers passed it up entirely for Nintendo's Link to the Past, Super Mario Kart, and Capcom's Street Fighter II, which also came out that year. With all that said, who is this game even meant for? Well, children. And I don't mean that to be insulting. Simply put, this game was a product of its time. As of now, the average gamer is somewhere between 25 and 35, depending on which surveys you look at. But a lot of people of every age play games now. In the early to mid 90s, the demographic was a lot more condensed, with the average age being anywhere from 8 to 16. Video games, like it or not, were seen more as a children's toy than anything else.
Your parents help you hook it up.
Mystic Quest's lack of deep story, the grade school level dialogue, its overall tone and positive themes, and the entirety of its gameplay was meant to cater to those who were just learning how to play video games. In an attempt to put that into perspective, this game released in 1992, the same year where shows like Batman the Animated Series and Lamb Chop's Play Along was airing between commercials for Crossfire, Crystal Pepsi, and Nickelodeon GAC. If you are 30 years old now, that means you were 7 years old when this released. It was marketed towards you. The typical derision Final Fantasy Mystic Quest has received is a bit misleading. Comparing Mystic Quest to Final Fantasy VI is like putting Goosebumps next to the works of H.P. Lovecraft. So instead of being entirely critical, let's take a look and see if Mystic Quest holds up to the goals that Square set for an entry-level RPG. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest wastes no time in getting you involved. Your village is gone and there's an old wise man who immediately starts breaking the fourth wall. He tells you that you are the hero of an ancient prophecy. 4 fiends have taken the elemental crystals and are draining their energy, and it's up to you to stop them. Benjamin, or whatever you decide to name him, has already seemed to have forgotten that everyone he's ever cared about, friends, family, his parents, they're probably all dead, and he agrees to help. As well as being an interesting callback to the first Final Fantasy, this is a refreshing change of pace. You are told immediately what your goal is and what you need to do. The narrative is weak, but it's very coherent and effectively moves you from point to point. You're never really wondering what you need to do next. The flat dialogue is very direct and clear, delivered by characters that have the most basic of personalities. And outside for a slightly interesting reveal at the end, the plot doesn't take any sharp turns. Mystic Quest feels like a bare essentials of the story. There isn't a whole lot of meat to it, but it also seems like they trimmed the fat. In fact, you can say that a lot about Mystic Quest. Everything seems to have been boiled down to the most basic concept. For example, instead of navigating the overworld yourself, you now select it as you would a level in Super Mario World. Armors and weapons are treated more as upgrades, and you only have to worry about 4 different kinds of items, as opposed to dealing with potions, high potions, X potions, ethers, high ethers, turtle shells, dark matter, elixirs, tissues, etc. This is easily one of the most pick up and play RPGs available. Anyway, to begin your adventure, you go to the level forest, which looks like it's campaigning to be a new modern military shooter level. You're told to find Kaylee and Foresta. Upon seeing the unrest in level forest and the trouble in the trees, Kaylee does what any self-respecting, nature-loving, druidic female protagonist would do. Coming across Satan's Christmas tree, surprise, Minotaur! He poisons Kaylee, who promptly returns by poisoning back. With life. Kaylee's mom, who had apparently been stalking you thinking that saving the forest was some kind of innuendo, asks you to go get the elixir from the Sand Temple. You go to the chest that was supposed to contain the elixir, only to find out it was filled with your hopes and dreams of starting a successful YouTube review channel. When the only guy with clearly in-game audible theme music shows up. Tristram, who happens to be an expert treasure hunter, attempts to extort 9,000 pieces of treasure out of your character in an attempt to save Kaylee's life. And because your parents didn't grow up in the 1% and you can't solve all your problems with gold, he makes you a counteroffer. If you help him get some treasure in Bone Dungeon, he'll give you the elixir. Not having much choice, your character reluctantly agrees and Tristram joins up with you. There are a few things you'll notice while in the dungeons. The most obvious that they're monsters just hanging out, as opposed to random encounters, meaning you can choose when and when not to fight. This is actually very welcome, as other RPGs were notorious for their frequency of random encounters. But in Mystic Quest, you are never caught unprepared, but even better, it allows you to move from area to area without being interrupted every 6 steps. You could avoid some encounters entirely or fight your way to that chest. Given a fork in a road, you can choose which battle you would prefer. Also, once an enemy is defeated, they're gone, making backtracking less of a hassle. The second thing you'll notice is that the dungeons are actually kind of fun. There are simple puzzle elements involving the jumping mechanic or one of your weapons that have outside uses. Swords allow you to reach switches, axes allow you to cut down trees, bombs blow open cracks in a wall, and claws allow you to climb up on the walls. This combined with the simple platforming mechanics make dungeons easily the best part of gameplay when it comes to Mystic Quest. None of the dungeons are particularly difficult, and some of the level design can be frustrating, but overall it's not bad. So after exploring the depths of Bone Dungeon, you eventually come across the game's first real boss, Flavorous Rex, which allows us to really savor the combat system. For the most part, it's your standard RPG. You have your fight, your spell, your items, and your defense. Certain enemies are weak to fire, ice, earth, and the like, but surprisingly your melee weapons can exploit certain weaknesses as well, such as trees being weak to axes or birds being weak to bows. As a gameplay mechanic, the most it will do is save you from having an extra round or 2 of combat, but it's a good introduction to other RPGs. There really isn't much strategy to fighting outside of that, making combat probably the weakest part of the entire Mystic Quest experience. Outside of a few enemies who might reflect a spell or an enemy who will counter a melee attack, and one particular boss that has a timing element, there isn't much need to do anything other than attack with your most damaging spell, which is unfortunate because combat will be the thing you'll be doing most. But just because the combat is simple doesn't mean it's easy. The most difficult part of fighting is the status effects that have a tendency to get you killed a lot in the game. Confusion, petrification, and paralysis can make fights go very bad very quickly. But if you die, you're given the option to start the fight right back at the beginning. There is no real penalty for death, which is good because often the death feels more like it's a stroke of bad luck than anything you've done. But what's important to note is the few things they did to make the game more accessible. First off, your health is by default a health bar instead of the numbers. Secondly, you can have your partner be controlled by the AI. While not perfect, the artificial intelligence is more competent than you would expect for an early Super Nintendo title. Being several levels higher than you, they can pull the weight of an inexperienced player. But even myself would prefer to have them on auto at times because they would make some battles quicker, or choose to heal in the middle of combat, saving me the trouble. However, you can set them to manual just in case they are stealing too many of your kills. The coolest addition is the enemy sprites. In a normal RPG, the sprite is usually static and you only know when it's dying after it's already dead. But in Mystic Quest, as you fight, you will see the enemy sprite change to show how much battle damage it's taken. This gives you a good sense of accomplishing something as the battle progresses. And the art design on the sprites is pretty chuckle-worthy as well. Unfortunately, none of this saves combat from being tedious. What is probably the only saving grace is the game's awesome fight themes. Though you would expect an amazing soundtrack from Final Fantasy, it was not Nobuo Uematsu who had lended his talents to the project. Instead, composer Ryuji Sasai had made his presence known on the soundtrack, and I would argue that it's easily the best part of the game. Ryuji Sasai had also composed the soundtrack to Bushido Blade 2, just in case you were wondering. After beating the Flamerous Rex, in a lucky coincidence, you also save the Crystal of Earth. Tristan gets his treasure and you get your elixir. Then upon leaving Bone Dungeon, you find that the forest has become a lush green. And in all seriousness, Mystic Quest gives you the impression that you're actually making a difference in the world with your actions. And this is not typically found in other titles. Upon returning and healing Kaylee, you continue on your journey to restore the other 3 crystals and fulfill the prophecy. The saddest part of all this is that Mystic Quest was a bit misguided, and possibly did more harm than good if it was trying to bring in new players. Mystic Quest, for all the things it did right in terms of simplifying an RPG, didn't really offer anything that would get people interested in playing RPGs to begin with. In fact, most of Mystic Quest's strengths lie in the things that wasn't typical for an RPG to do. Those who would have started with Mystic Quest would be disappointed to find out that many other entries would lack the action elements. Meanwhile, the market that enjoyed role-playing games were insulted that we received Mystic Quest instead of Final Fantasy V, which was almost completely translated for a Western release as Final Fantasy Extreme! The basic plot and simple gameplay did nothing for the game's word-of-mouth sales. Despite succeeding at its design, there simply wasn't a market for Mystic Quest. But it wasn't a complete failure. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, for all its shortcomings, taught Square one valuable lesson. It wasn't that we Americans weren't interested in role-playing games because of their difficulty. We just needed more RPGs that interested us. The outcry against Mystic Quest led Square to localize more RPGs over in the States, including Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, and Super Mario RPG, the latter co-directed by Chihiro Fujioka. Yes, the very same man who brought you Mystic Quest. But despite its good intentions, Mystic Quest still remains a bit of a black sheep. Is it a good game? Well, no, but it's also not an incompetent experience. Everything was purposeful and well designed, especially considering that Mystic Quest was a very small game in scale. Ted Woolsey in an interview said, quote, "It was a little 4 megabyte game, which is basically a Game Boy game that was put on the SNES. There was just an excruciatingly small amount of space to spin a yarn, as it were. But in the end, it's not about the intention, it's about the delivery." And unfortunately, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest failed to deliver. But Mystic Quest isn't a terrible experience, and is by no means the worst Final Fantasy when it comes to design. It is one of those games, though, that each person has to make their own judgment if this experiment is worth their time. If nothing else, it's a short, simple, and somewhat charming romp that's available on Virtual Console, and a physical cartridge isn't very expensive either. But it's also easy to understand why someone wouldn't enjoy their experience with it either. With all that said, is there a place in this world for entry-level games? Possibly, but it's really more about providing experience to your players. One that will stick with them and they'll remember fondly and want to go back to time and time again. After all, that experience builds character. This is SoberDwarf, and thanks for watching. Hey, thanks for watching my video. I have 2 more videos if you want to watch them. One's on Bushido Blade 1 and the other is on Bushido Blade 2. I would recommend watching the first one before the second one, but who am I to tell you what to do? Unless I'm telling you to subscribe, you should do that. Please?